Hi everyone, today I wanted to talk about sinus infections, but we have to understand sinuses before we can understand sinus infections, and this is something that confuses people a lot. So sinuses are air-filled spaces that are in the bones of our face and our skull and around our nose and our eyes. So there are these spaces basically around here, and they're lined with mucous membranes that produce mucus. Mucus is a sticky substance. We know what mucus is, and the reason why it's important is it traps dust and microbes that can cause infection. It keeps our nasal passages moist and free of these pathogens. There's 4 pairs of sinuses. Our frontal sinuses are in our forehead, our maxillary sinuses are behind our cheeks, our ethmoid sinuses are between our eyes, and then the sphenoid sinuses are deep behind our nose. So with sinus infections are also called sinusitis because itis means inflammation. And this happens when the mucous membranes that's lining our sinuses becomes inflamed due to an infection from a microbe. This leads to swelling and mucus buildup. And when the sinus openings become blocked, it creates a perfect environment for microbes like viruses or bacteria to grow. The most common causes of sinus infections are viruses, which are similar to the viruses that cause the common cold. Viral infections are responsible for most sinus infections, but bacteria can also be the cause, especially if there's an initial viral infection that doesn't clear up, and this leads to a secondary bacterial infection. So mostly they're viral infections, but sometimes sinus infections can be bacterial and they're treated differently. So at a cellular level, what happens is when you have an infection, microbial infection, your sinuses are infected with the virus or the bacteria, your immune system will turn on, white blood cells will go to the infected area to try to fight the infection, and these white blood cells release chemicals that cause inflammation. The inflammation results in swelling, which blocks our sinus openings, and also the cilia, which are hair-like structures that normally move mucus out of our sinuses, become less effective, and this leads to mucus buildup, increased pressure, and a lot of times people will say that they have a headache because of this. So the symptoms of a sinus infections are usually pretty annoying. They include nasal congestion from all the mucus buildup. There's facial pain or pressure, headaches, and sometimes there can be fever. These symptoms usually make people feel pretty miserable, and there are ways to help treat them. So a lot of times it's clearing up the mucus. Like people say that very hot showers helps, saline sprays, but treating the infection also depends on the underlying cause. So for viral sinus infections, it's supportive care like most viral infections like rest, hydration, maybe over-the-counter decongestants. But for sinus infections that are bacterial, they may require antibiotics. So for viral infections, we don't give antibiotics. For bacterial sinus infections, sometimes they are given antibiotics. And then for chronic sinus infections, which are sinus infections that last for multiple weeks, you may need additional treatments like nasal steroids to calm down the inflammation, just to help with all the drainage and the function here. There are potential complications to sinus infections. There's potential complications to any infection, but if a sinus infection is left untreated, it can spread, which can happen with any infection. So the infection can spread to nearby structures, causing conditions like an infection, usually like around the tissues of the eye. They can lead to meningitis, which is an infection of the membrane surrounding our brain and spinal cord. It can also lead to a bone infection. So these complications are rare, but they can happen with a sinus infection or just infections in general.